Each year, one of the great joys of this job is working with all the different presidents. And so I often team up with one of them, and I interview that president about some of the lessons they have learned, and then intersperse lessons I have learned. And I may well be calling on one of you a year hence. But it's always great to hear and share the learning among presidents. So I would like to symbolically do a chalice lighting in thankfulness for all who serve and for the larger mission of our faith. So be it. I am one of your congregational life consultants. I work full-time for you. Don't forget this. There are a number of us in the region, and we are always glad to help. There's sometimes limitations on what we can do in travel, but increasingly we use online forums like this, and any way we can support you in your work, feel free. If you have a committee that wants to needs somebody to talk something through with, you can refer them to us as an assistant. We can set up a Skype meeting like this or a Zoom meeting like this. So there are a variety of ways that we can help out. Our second presenter is Tony Sweazy, who is currently the president of the Thomas Jefferson UU congregation in Louisville, Kentucky. And Tony got to know us because he was on the staff of our Midwest Leadership School for 3 years, which is a week-long leadership school experience in the summer, which we now hold at Luther College in Decorah, Iowa.
I'll introduce myself a little bit. This is my second time around at Thomas Jefferson Unitarian Church being president. 3 or 4 years ago, I was president, and I was, you can look at it, the glass half full or glass half empty. I'm fortunate enough to be president again this year in some trying times of interim ministry. I did serve 3 years at Midwest Leadership School with Ian and the fantastic staff of our region. And they are always ready to help anytime. They're only a phone call away. And I do have a lot of gratitude, and sometimes it makes me wonder why he asked me, but I really am appreciative and in awe that he asked me to do this with him.
So I'm Ian Evison, and I started with an introduction of myself, so I will now continue here. First lesson is from Tony, and it was the first thing that he mentioned when I interviewed him about what he learned from the work. So go ahead, Tony.
Yeah, so when Ian and I spoke, I guess a little over a couple weeks ago, and I probably won't remember everything that we talked about, but as it occurs to me today, the first time I was president, I had some advice from other presidents from our congregation, and it was to have a plan, have basically 3 points that you wanted to take care of throughout the year. And I quickly learned that those were my points. Those are the things that I wanted to do. And while they were all necessary and maybe good ideas, other ideas presented themselves very quickly. And so, one of the things that I learned in leadership, not only in my church, but run a business and things like that, things don't always go as smoothly or as predictive, that many times you have to adapt to what's in front of you. And that's not a bad thing. That's an opportunity for growth too.
Thank you. Yeah, about this time in the year, I always have a series of conversations with presidents who said, I never guessed what I would be dealing with when I said yes 5 months ago. And the ability to be adaptive to the new challenges that arise are really key. Another one is do your homework. You really don't, in a way, have much power as president, in a sense, but there's huge power in doing your homework and thoughtfully working on preparing the agenda and really being thoughtful about what items are ready for decision. And it depends, depending on your circumstances. Sometimes people make a discipline of having a meeting with the staff leadership and maybe the vice president and president the week before the board meeting to figure out the agenda. And your ability to have that prepared can be really powerful in using the time well of the people there. You know, one of the tricks of this is that people who are on UU boards generally are used to being effective and moving work along in other settings. And the situation, we have our board meetings in the evening after the average board member has already done a day of work and then a day of family stuff. So it really needs discipline at that time to have a meeting that's going to be satisfying and productive and doesn't, you know, take over long. And you doing your homework as president, always with help, is one thing that can really be very, very helpful. Anybody who has sounds in the background, you'll see a mute, and just use that. Oops, yeah. Excuse me.
I wanted to touch on a little bit of the agenda. You know, really, that's the only, like Ian said, that's the only power a president really has. It's also a tool for respect for each of the board members. When I set up an agenda, our meetings run for 2 hours. They might go 2 hours and 5 minutes, but they don't go any longer than that. And that's a respect for the agenda and for the work and the volunteer work that we're doing with one another and for one another and for the church. And I've always looked at it that if I had a board meeting that goes 3 or 4 hours, wow, that's, you know, other people, we all have something else to do whenever we leave church, or at least I do. And so I've always made a really strong point, and I've heard from a lot of congregations, a lot of people from leadership schools, that their board meetings will go 3 or 4 hours. They start at 7 o'clock at night, and they don't end till 10 o'clock, 10:30. And I don't know who can function after a full day's worth of work for 4 hours. So I just wanted to echo what Ian was saying.
And often that requires encouraging people to stop talking or not make the second comment. And the thing to realize is that if somebody tells you to wrap it up when you're making a point, of course that doesn't feel good. But often if you ask the group as a whole whether they want you to move things along more quickly, they'll say yes, definitely. So don't hesitate to be somewhat directive in the service of, you know, finishing pretty much in the time you've set. And if you're having trouble fitting the agenda in that length of time, talk with people about it. at the end, say it sounded like we were having trouble, what was going on, rather than simply letting the meetings go longer.
Yeah, and something else that helps with that is making sure you have a timekeeper. You don't always have to look like the bad guy. If you've got a timekeeper that keeps looking at you and saying, hey, we're 3 minutes over, we're 7 minutes over. But I also learned something from my previous minister, and it was just because you've got 10 minutes for an item doesn't mean that item doesn't take 20 or 25 minutes to discuss and maybe come to a conclusion. But that also means that you have to alter your agenda a little bit. Again, back to the first point, you have to adapt to it, and you have to kind of move along. And there are some things you can reprioritize the agenda so that you can move it to the next meeting, or not even address it at all if it's not appropriate.
This one's you, Tony.
Oh, yeah. So listening and be present. In my first term, I kind of understood that when there's a group of people in a congregation that really need to be heard, when some issues are going on, whether it be from a financial point of view or from a employee congregation relationship, that it's really not hard to have to listen. Many people will come up and talk to you. If you're not president now, or if you've been president before and you're president now, you've quickly learned that when you're president, people notice that you've got an open door all the time, even though you don't have a door. You're always there to listen, and they want to be heard. And that's not a bad thing. It's an opportunity. I think one of the things that I learned from this particular topic was, when you go to church, you get to know people in a certain way. But when you become president, you learn many more people, and you learn them in a completely different way, because they have a tendency, and it's not bad, but to be a little bit more intimate. And what I mean by intimate is they don't mind delving into serious conversation about what's going on at church.
Goes along with this, don't be afraid to set limits. I hear of presidents who take calls during dinner, take calls late, early, during time when they're relaxing. It's very important that you figure out sort of what the limits are, and not go over that. I've talked to quite a few spouses of presidents who felt like their spouse had a real struggle doing this, saying, I'm at, we're at dinner, or not answering, not answering if they're at dinner, just letting it go to voicemail, or saying, I'm in the middle of something, can I phone you back tomorrow morning? Don't be hesitant. Being a good listener doesn't mean that you have to be present to people 24/7. You'll be more ready to be present if you can channel it if needed. And this is of course hardest if there's a crisis of some sort. But even then, try to keep things within within limits. I had a president who was going through something very difficult last winter, and his thing was snowshoeing in northern Minnesota, and every once in a while he'd tell me, time for me to go snowshoeing again, because that was really when nobody could connect with him and he could really relax, and that's important too. Fourth lesson, be careful about micromanaging. It is the easiest thing in the world when an issue comes up at the board for people to want to problem solve the details of it rather than focus on what they really need to decide about it. And the classic thing here is a committee's working on something and they tell the board, well, we just want to update you. And, they're worried about the board second guessing them, so they update. But what happens when they bring the update is everybody starts, brainstorming what color the room should be painted and where you can get the paint cheaply. So really discipline yourself to not micromanaging. And sometimes people think this just applies to, congregations with staff or a minister, that it's important to delegate things to the minister, and that's true. But it's also true it's equally true in a lay-led congregation, because the tendency for everybody to feel like they need to talk everything through can really be a barrier. And so you need to do a lot of affirming to people. It's okay if you wanted to, it's okay for you to decide this. It's okay for you to spend up to whatever is in your budget. And if they say, well, I just want advice about it, any two board members outside the meeting can help them brainstorm. If what they need is kind of help brainstorming, that's fine, but be careful about having that be part of what the board does. Fifth lesson, Tony.
Yeah, so, conversations, trying to pull people into the conversation, I think one of my strong points as one of the leaders was always kind of taking the pulse of the group that you're in. I can't tell you how many times I've been in a meeting where maybe a group of 6, 8 people, let's say 8 people, and 3 people pretty much dominate the conversation. The other 3 people every once in a while throw in a few little tidbits of information. And then there's always 1 or 2 people always in the back of the room that don't say anything at all. And I think what I've learned is you don't have to ask them immediately what their thoughts are, but I bet you $1 what they're doing is back there really processing all the information they've heard. And what they're doing, they're waiting for an opportunity for somebody to say, it's okay to talk. And then once they start throwing in some information, I think you'll find that they've got some of the most valuable information, because they've been back there sitting and processing everything that's been said from everybody else. So it's important. In this particular board that I'm on right now, I'm probably the least outspoken of everybody. But it's not my job to necessarily, it's my job to facilitate. It's not my job I do provide information, but I'd rather hear mostly from them. But the first time I was president, actually when I was president-elect, I could see myself being one of these people that always sat in the back, waited to be asked what to do and what I thought about something. So, I don't think you have to immediately say, hey, the quiet guy or woman, what do you have to say? Just kind of let it go a little bit, but don't forget them. Make sure they're invited into the conversation.
And this includes more broadly always having a consciousness of who's not in the conversation, who might be. Young people, older people. There are many efforts to improve the handicapped accessibility of congregations where somehow people forgot to talk to the people with mobility problems, or forgot to ask the youth or young adults. And it's just very important that you be enough apart from the conversation that you can really think to yourself, who's being left out of this that we might invite in? And that's a very important role. Whoop. Okay, next one is me. Tony's really right about how you never know what's going to, what you're going to have to confront as a president. But still, it's important to stay focused on the big picture and frame the things that are being done in terms of the larger purposes of the congregation, what your mission is, what we're trying to strive for as Unitarian Universalists. People really like to see themselves as part of a larger narrative. And so if you're working on building, it's what kind of church home do you want, and what service, what function do you want to have that, that in the community? If it's something with RE, it's what the educational mission of your congregation is. And try always to help people connect smaller things that you're doing with those larger purposes. And then ask people outside the meetings, what should our congregation be doing in social justice? What should our congregation be doing as an education ministry? And not necessarily just the ones on that committee, but see yourself as nurturing that larger conversation in the church. Board meetings can reduce to a sort of listing each month of the stuff that needs to be dealt with, and there will be a lot of that. But it's important, if only to the satisfaction of those serving, that you work to connect that with the larger narrative. Tony.
Yeah, it's this is one of those things where, again, kind of trying to take care of yourself, like Ian was saying a few minutes ago, in regards to having boundaries and things like that. But you can't. We're all going to make mistakes. We all make mistakes, and when we make mistakes, there's you feel like 100 pairs of eyes are looking at you. And it's okay to make mistakes, and don't take it personally. I've made plenty of mistakes. I'm not a very good public speaker, and but what I've kind of learned is going through all this is going through leadership school, listening to Ian talk at one of the final days that he spoke at leadership school. And it was, whenever you're doing this work, you're doing it with people who love you, and you're doing it because you love what you're doing, or the mission of the church. It's every year is different. Every congregation is different, and it's being a president. It's not something easy. My wife will tell you that. It can take an enormous amount of time. Or this time around, I'm learning how to set better boundaries for myself, so it doesn't end up like that. Ian?
Yeah, this is one thing you have to realize is that when you're in a role like the president, people in unexpected ways see you differently, and you become a screen. You can become a screen for, on whom they express whatever their feelings are about things. And it's important to take that in stride. And, if people are upset about this or upset about that, listen, but not, and take it seriously, but don't take it personally. A lot of presidents talk to me about the burden they feel in being president, and they're made anxious by the number of people who express different kinds of anxious energy to them, and that's inevitable. We're all human. But remember that part of the role is that you're the recipient for some of that stuff, and try to let it wash off, and then listen to the support you get, because it's easy to listen to the frustrated voices, but you're generally also getting a lot of support and appreciation, and remember to take that seriously also.
Yeah, one more thing on that. I can remember 3-4 years ago, we had an issue where the board didn't resolve something in the manner that one of the congregants wanted it resolved, and he said some things that were kind of hurtful to me, and I kept that for about 2 months, and then I finally confronted him about it. And when you don't take things personally, I think it's more appropriate for me. The way I interpret that is, and the way I explained it to this person was, I'm doing the work on behalf of the church. I'm not doing the work on behalf of one person. And the board made a decision that they thought was better for the church, not that one person. So, okay.
Well, on that, there's a technique which I think it's important to learn how to do. If you talk to people individually, you get a better idea of what makes them tick and what their particular concerns are. But beware of listening to all these people individually and thinking it's your job to make things come out right. This is one of the big pieces of advice also to young ministers. So the person comes to the person who's the youth advisor comes and wants to have the youth paint the youth room, and the person who was just head of the effort to renovate the building, is upset at the idea that, the youth might ruin this gorgeous new paint job. And your instinct should be to find a way to get those two people into conversation, not to yourself find the way between them. So I think an instinct for saying, oh, well, sounds like we need a conversation about that. Because often people are more, if you're supportive of the conversation, they'll work things out between themselves in a compromise that you wouldn't even expect, or they'll at least see that the reason you're not just saying yes to your point of view is this other person. And it's important not to get into that position of feeling yourself, oh, hi, we have someone with us here. It's important not to get yourself into that position where you feel responsible for making things come out right when people have disagreements, or being a ping pong ball between them. Now, one of the things which comes as many people have had other roles in church, like being the chair of this or that. And one of the ways in which being president really differs is you need to work by delegating stuff. And I would be very specific about that. Like, say, Tony, could you come to us next month with a proposal for so-and-so? Or, any pieces of work, could you ask another person, could you convene a discussion about so-and-so so that everybody one Sunday after church who wants to express a point of view about whatever, has the opportunity to. And doing a lot of assigning of work to other people, I think is very good. And even in the meetings, Tony mentioned a timekeeper, and you can actually ask people to lead different parts of the meeting. Say, Jane, could you lead us through a discussion of this next item? And it actually makes the meetings more interesting to have different voices and men and women, young and old, in that leadership of the meeting role. So don't feel like you need to be doing all of that. And especially if there's a crisis, find ways to separate what needs to be done into parts and delegate those out. I mean, we had, unfortunately, we've had a lot of issues with figuring out how to deal with somebody with a past as a child sex offender. And in that, there are 15 parts. There's talking to the insurance company. There's talking to the region about what a sample policy might be. There's having a meeting with parents. And don't feel that you have to do those things or even be at all those things. Sort of have your role thinking of what the buckets of work are that need doing and handing those out rather than feeling that you need to do them all.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's, as a president, you've got enough work, setting up your executive committee, trying to get your church calendar done for the year, preparing your agenda for the meeting. One of the things that we try to do, we have liaisons for different important, like standing committees in our congregation. And so somebody from the board will report on that sort of thing. And it's monotonous to hear one person talk through the whole meeting. But also don't forget, like Ian said, if you're in a crisis and something really serious is going on, I have found myself personally, it's difficult not to get outside help. And that's where Ian and his group come in. Even bouncing things off. When you would go to leadership school, we develop a network of a lot of people, probably 30 people a year. And so those are people that we can use as resources. So how'd you handle this? In this situation, what was the result? What came of it? And how'd you handle it? So.
Past presidents often can function in that role for you as a listening ear for new presidents. You can ask them the same question, sort of, what did they learn? And, if they were to do it, what advice do they have for you? And people are willing to give support. And delegating isn't the same. I think it's much easier than getting people to agree to be on a committee for the whole year. That if you ask somebody to do something based on, it's a very specific task that can be done, in a fairly short time out of a clear need, it's much easier, and especially if you can compliment somebody and say, you know, you really seem to have a lot of good ideas about that. How about consulting some people and bringing back a suggestion? Very few people will say no, or far less than if you're asking them to be on a committee. So be brave about, you know, asking for help. Tony.
Yeah. So, you know, as being president for a couple of different years, I've really taken this as a huge opportunity to learn a lot more about myself. I journal, or I used to journal a lot. I don't so much anymore, but you know, when you talk to people, people are just a reflection of yourself in different areas. And when you interact with people, and their problems or their issues or their crisis, sometimes I get to look at myself and help myself grow from that. Ian, go ahead with this if you can.
Yeah, another turn on that is it's fashionable almost as a kind of modesty to talk down these roles in a church, to say, well, I guess I only did this because I didn't run fast enough or nobody else wanted to do it. Understand that you're putting out an image of what leadership is. And, you know, if honestly your experience of being a leader is negative, I'm not saying be dishonest about it, but be careful about putting out a thoughtlessly negative image if you want to recruit other people. And often when I talk to people privately, they talk about learning a lot, about it being a religiously deepening experience for them, about getting skills that were important to them at work. And don't be hesitant about saying those things, because that is what sets things up for bringing other people into the work. That even if it's hard, to bring to the fore that, you know, how it's been an opportunity for you. There's a little bit of a generational shift in this also, in that there used to be more of a separation between the organizational work of the church and whatever we thought was the religious or spiritual. So the program elements were the religious or spiritual, and the being on committees or being on the board was the organizational work. And they were clearly separated. I have noticed strongly with a generational shift to Gen Xers and even more to millennials that they really expect their role of volunteer service to be also personally fulfilling and a growth opportunity. And it's funny because I made this point and I talked about it being a generational thing. And somebody who deals with older adults and volunteering said, well, that I was out of touch with what volunteering was for retired people now, and that really that's taken a turn towards this also, that you know, when people retire and volunteer for things, they don't just want to be useful, they want this to be personally meaningful work from which they're going to grow. And I suppose, I really think that that's true in my experience. So, you know, understand that this is an opportunity to grow for you, and then don't be hesitant about, you know, talking about that part of the experience and bringing that forward.
Yeah. One last point on that. It is rewarding it's working in a group of people and having something actually work is probably one of the most rewarding things that I've experienced, particularly working in groups at church. I work in groups outside of church, but with leadership school, with my board meetings, it's some of the most fulfilling work I've ever done.
So the 10th of our 10 lessons here, it may sound like it contradicts what we said at the beginning about adapting. And it does in a way, but it's one of those dialectics where both sides have a truth to them. I think it's important early in the year to try to get clear the few most important things that you want to do. When I interview people for whom it was not a good experience to be on the board, one of the lines I often hear is the year got away from us. Now, this doesn't mean, well, there was a particular crisis and we had to deal with it, because that often feels very meaningful. I mean, if you have a crisis over a major employee, everybody knows, why that's important. I mean, if you have a fire, if you have a social justice thing, that actually feels meaningful. But the idea that a year went by without really engaging anything important, that can really be discouraging to people. And the rule of thumb I have is, if something is going to happen during the year, you need to talk about it from the beginning, and it needs to have a good start on it before Thanksgiving and Christmas. There comes a point not long after the turn of the new year where it begins to feel, oh, I guess we're not going to get to that. And so getting started, whatever the key things, and I'm not talking about 15, I'm talking about 3 that you want to do this year, getting agreement on those and getting started early, and then having one of your roles as president be, to, ask the person who has agreed to do the plan for the renovation of this area, how's that going? What support can we use? Are you going to be ready to bring it to the board meeting in October or November? Sort of keep that moving along and be especially intentional about that early in the year. Now, if authentically some other big thing comes up, it's fine to say, well, that was more important, and to shift to that instead. But then have that be what you're working on. Is that fairly, or let's say, Tony, do you have thoughts there? I think you're muted.
Sorry about that. My wife was walking around and I didn't want too much noise. Yeah, so I was thinking about that when you were talking, and this is a year that we're going, we had a minister for 31 years and he retired this year. So we're going through interim ministry, and that clearly was one of the things that's probably the top thing on my agenda. The other thing we had was a capital campaign last year that was fairly successful. And so we're working on trying to figure out when the money comes in, how to take care of that, the needs of the church, and then some of the wish list type items, and prioritize those. But making you've always got those 1, 2, or 3 things in the back of your mind that you're working on, and there's going to be another 50 or so that come up. Oh, there needs to be a bylaw change. Oh, somebody wants to sponsor another group that you need congregational approval. You've always got those things that are going to come in and not necessarily trip you up, but they're going to slow you down from looking at the other stuff. But that's not necessarily a bad thing either. Slowing down to maybe reconsider your approach on something might be good too.
Yeah, I mean, that's that brings up for me a big thing we've all been working on learning. One of the things that's cultural about a lot of our UU organizations is the part about always being in a hurry and feeling we need to be productive. And one thing we've realized is how much that can stand in the way of having the conversations that we need to have. And so, yes, it's important to have a plan and not to forget it, but it's also important to let the discussions take the time that they need to take. And that can sometimes feel excruciating to those who are most inside, because you can feel like you've talked about it forever, but there's still people further out in the congregation who are just getting awareness of it. So be careful about be intentional, keep things moving, have your idea of plan, but be careful about being impatient.
Yeah.
More on that, Tony?
Patience is the key for me. There are things that I would, like I said, we've got an interim minister. We don't know. We're only a couple months into it right now, about a month and a half. And there are certain steps that we need to be taken, and it's all unpredictable. I mean, we knew somebody for over 30 years, and now we don't know anybody, or we know this new person for maybe 30 days, 30, 60 days. And it's completely new. It's, you knew how the other minister would work, and you knew how to approach him or her. The new minister, his door's always open, but you don't know how they're going to work. Particularly in a board meeting, I sincerely miss my previous minister. He was an attorney, and he really methodical, and institutional knowledge was incredible. So that's about it.
I want to talk a little bit about resources, but let me leave a space here if there are questions on any of the things we've said or anything else about being a president that any of you have.
Yes, I have a question.
Yes, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes,
we
can.
So the question is the challenge to get people engaged in work, and it always seems like we have too much work and not enough people who are willing to step forward. And I'm just wondering if you have any suggestions for recruiting for committees, or maybe condensing work of committees to try to make the job, to try to recruit and make it so that the work is shared.
You want to start at that, Tony, or?
That's really tough. We're going through that. We started a process a couple of years ago. We tried to reduce the number of committees. We tried to say, okay, we had committees, Then we tried to reduce the number of committees and make work groups, so there was less reporting requirements. That didn't, by the way, that didn't work extremely well, because when you take a committee and you say, no, they're going to be a work group now, all of a sudden they have an issue with they're not as important, perceived as important as somebody else or another committee. One of the things we do every year, we have a committee fair and it's coming up at the end of this month. But we have an opportunity for people to kind of list out what they're interested in, what passions they have, and what skills sets they have. And then we can kind of pull them in that way. As well as we have neighborhood groups and chalice circles or small group ministries, whatever people call them, that get more people interested. Because I think the more you engage people, I think they're more likely to join you on a committee or in a social justice atmosphere or something like that. But I think engagement is probably the key.
Yeah, I don't want to say, I'm hesitant to say anything because I don't want to make it sound like there's an easy solution to this one, because it's a perpetual question. I would say maybe two or three things. One is the way people involve themselves is changing. And people used to really like the regularity of being on a committee that met first Tuesday of the month. I mean, they liked the regularity and clarity of that. As people get busier, and especially younger people, it's harder and harder to make them do that kind of commitment. So my daughter is very active in the UU Church in Palo Alto. She's a tech person in Silicon Valley. And they said to her, would you help us design a new sound system for the church? And she was very enthusiastic about that. But if you had said, would you be on the sound committee? She never would have said yes to that. And so I think being able to cut the work into different shaped pieces is important. I was talking to somebody about involvement in choirs. Well, it takes a brave person to come to a choir rehearsal, especially a man, because there's no term of service on that. You go to that first rehearsal and you're there till your voice gives out. And that's a strong discouragement to involvement. And so what this place was trying was to have instances where people could try music. Let's say before Christmas, we're going to have a group sing a madrigal for Christmas, and they're going to have 4 meetings, and it's going to be fun. And our choir director is going to lead that. I mean, think in terms of different shaped bites of work. That's important. And also, I think people need to learn how to do a better job of inviting people, because that idea of a committee fair shows people the range of opportunities that are available, and indeed does get some people. But the way you get people to step up to larger commitments is a much more specific kind of thing. So in other words, I get Tony to be on this thing tonight, not by inviting him into a general committee on whatever. Given his other responsibilities, he would have gone running, but rather saying, I've really heard you be wise, Tony, on being a president, and heard compliments of you and seen you deal with a lot of good stuff. how would you be willing to do that? You know, would you be willing to do that more specific thing with me? So I think the asks need to be more focused and more personal than we tend to make them. This said, the fact of people being overcommitted and overbusy and trying to get people, there is no, I don't want to put forward anything as if it is the answer. I'll just say that a lot of the work I admire is people who are able to rethink the work. The church where I grew up, Beverly Unitarian Church on the south side of Chicago, they had a rummage sale each year, and that was a huge amount of work. Well, they just had to push too hard to get volunteers for it. And they're on a very prominent corner in the community. And they reinvented that into charging $50 a table for anybody who wanted to have a flea market for the day. And they made nearly as much money by letting people set up tables for a flea market on their front lawn as they did for the rummage sale. Now that was brilliance. And I don't know how you mechanize or turn that into a formula, but reinventing the work so it's more manageable, I think is when I see people get partial solutions to this that I really admire, it's often that people get brilliant ideas like that. Is any of that helpful as an answer?
Yes, yeah, I think that those are things that I think works. And it was part of what we were thinking about the conversation that we would be having, is trying to identify tasks versus committee assign, you know, and take the work of the committee and define it into tasks, and then see if we can recruit someone to do X task or maybe X and Y tasks, but not necessarily have to attend a regular meeting.
That sounds brilliant. I've particularly seen building and grounds committees work that well that way. Mm-hmm. Less and less people come to the meeting, that the meeting be coordinating, and then having that be the meetings be making sure that those who are volunteering have the support that they need. Thanks. Well, we're nearing the end of our hour, so I want to go on to say, make sure that you call on us. We're here to serve you. Also, I don't have it written here, but my colleague Lisa is going to have a monthly call for presidents, and it's a new thing for us. We're very excited. The Southern region has done a parallel version. We're doing a parallel version nationally for presidents of large congregations, and they really have liked the ability to go much more into depth into particular areas like stewardship or whatever. And that also allows us to bring in other, outside resources. So consider that. You'll find that on our website. And thank you for serving. I'm very conscious that it's the work of people like you as presidents who really make our movement grow and thrive in all the different local communities. And may your service be an adventure of growth and learning.